After that, my mom died in that same house. She actually committed suicide, which is relevant to the story. And then a year after that, I was diagnosed with Lyme disease, which, as many of the people watching this who have had a mold problem or have had Lyme disease know, that these are kissing cousins and that they exacerbate each other's symptoms. Mold and Lyme together is a real doozy. The combination of my mother's premature departure and Lyme disease forced me to drop out of high school.
Power in your purpose, the C60 way.
Welcome to the Powering Your Purpose podcast, formerly known as C60 Health Connections. On this podcast, we explore healthy lifestyle choices and wellness resources intended to accelerate your healing journey and help you move forward in life. Your goal, if you aren't tuned into it already, is to remember and actualize your purpose on the planet. You see, I know you've got a very big mission. You've got a unique God-given destiny, and the team behind you at Powering Your Purpose, well, you can think about us as your pit crew on the racetrack of life. We are bringing you resources to get unstuck, elevate, and energize your life so you can move forward with confidence, clarity, and enough energy to bring your big dream forward. On today's episode, we are going to meet with my friend Jason Earl, who is a man on a mission. Jason is an entrepreneur, a father, a husband, and a self-proclaimed indoor air quality crusader. Jason is the founder and CEO of Got Mold and the creator of the Got Mold test kit. The realization that his moldy childhood home was the underlying cause of his extreme allergies and asthma led Jason into the healthy home business in 2002, where he left a very successful career on Wall Street. Over the past 2 decades, Jason has performed countless sick building investigations. He solved many medical mysteries along the way, and he's helped thousands of families recover their health and their peace of mind. Jason has personally helped me and my family understand the negative impacts that mold can have on our health. You see, we've been fighting Lyme disease for several years now, and I can tell you it is no fun. Moving out of a moldy home or a moldy work environment can be one of the best things that you can do to start feeling better in a very short amount of time. Jason has been featured on Good Morning America, Extreme Makeover, the Home Edition, The Dr. Oz Show, Entrepreneur, Wired, and so much more. Today, I am honored to introduce you to my friend, Jason Earl. I hope you enjoy this conversation as much as I did. For those folks that are interested in optimizing their health, why is understanding mold a critical component to helping us improve not only our longevity, but our overall well-being?
Well, there's a bunch of reasons for that. First of all, air is one of these strange things. It's hiding in plain sight, right? So we're surrounded by it, but it's often an afterthought when it comes to the environmental exposures that we have. So if you look at the 4 basic human needs, and some people might even argue 5 basic human needs if you include sunlight. So air, water, food, shelter, and of course, sunlight. You can live without shelter for a long time. You can live without food for a few weeks. You can live without water for a few days, but you can only live without air for a few minutes. And yet this is something that we think about very little unless it's, smells bad, tastes bad, or we don't have enough of it. And so what's interesting about that is that despite the fact that it's the thing that we think about the least, it happens to be our single largest environmental exposure. So we breathe 13 to 15 times a minute, which comes out to about 20,000 times a day. And if you do the math on it, it's kind of wild. It's 2,000 gallons, which is enough to fill a swimming pool. And then if you do the further math, 30 pounds of air is your daily consumption. 30 pounds of air, if you can get your mind around that. And so if you drink your recommended 8 glasses of water, that's a half a gallon, that's 4 pounds. If you eat 3 meals a day, that's about 4 pounds of food. So you got about 8 pounds in food and water, and yet you're breathing 30 pounds of air. So in weight alone, it's a massive exposure, but in terms of volume, it's orders of magnitude. So it's extremely important that we get that clean and clear, because think about those 20,000 breaths as 20,000 doses, right? If you take 20,000 doses of anything, it better be good. That's first. Second of all, mold is highly inflammatory. Many people talk about mold in terms of its toxicity, and that is important because certain molds do produce toxins. In fact, beyond mycotoxins, the musty smell is in fact neurotoxic. So you don't have to have mycotoxins to have a toxic exposure to mold. It's a very important point. You don't have to have one of the molds that people talk about all the time, Stachybotrys and Chytomium, for example, to have a real problem. But all molds are inflammatory, especially to the population that is particularly susceptible to these inflammagens. And so if you are doing all the right things, you're, eating well, you're exercising, you're meditating, you're getting your 8 hours of sleep, you're thinking good thoughts, you're doing all that stuff, but you're in a moldy environment, you will undermine all of the progress. You'll cap it. It's essentially kryptonite. So in due time, it will weaken everyone. Some people more susceptible than others, of course, and some people are more abruptly affected. But it will take down even the strongest of us, even Superman.
Yeah. So you just said a few words that I want to make sure we get a little help clarifying and defining because I don't think everybody knows. So you mentioned mycotoxins and neurotoxins. Could you give us some definition around like what are those and why should we care?
Sure. So, well, mycotoxins are what they call secondary metabolites. So that's another kind of technical word, but metabolites are the byproduct of metabolism. So the byproduct of digestion, really. And so mycotoxins are the toxins that some molds produce. Sometimes, specifically when they're under threat or where there's a sort of a competitive environment, and they release these mostly to subdue competition. Mold cares about what it's eating on the surface that it's growing on. And so it will release these toxins to keep other microbes from growing there. The most famous one, by the way, just as a quick side note, is penicillin. So when Dr. Alexander Fleming discovered penicillin, it was because he had gone out to lunch and left the plate off of one of the petri dishes where he was growing streptococcus. So a errant spore landed on the dish and grew a colony. And then there was a little moat around this green fuzzy colony when he noticed it a day later. And so he called that mold juice. That was the technical term, I guess, back then. But we now know that as penicillin, but it's actually a mycotoxin that's excreted by Penicillium nostratum. So mycotoxins and antibiotics are actually the same thing in that particular context. So mycotoxins kill things we don't want, though, and antibiotics kill things we do. A little bit of a convenient naming convention there. So mycotoxins are specific to molds, though. Unlike some toxins that are produced by mushrooms, which are also within the same family. And then when it comes to neurotoxins are toxins that affect our neurological system, right? Common symptoms of neurotoxins are cognitive impairment and locomotive disorder, right? Difficulty with your limbs and things like that. So, neurotoxins are no joke. We want to avoid those at all costs.
That makes a lot of sense. All right, so I want to take a step back because you're 23 years deep into this journey of understanding all things mold. Most of us are just not at that level, let's be honest. I want to go back in time. So you had some extreme issues growing up with your health. Can you talk to us about like what inspired you to really dive deep into understanding mold and like what happened in your life, Jason, that brought you here?
Well, it's a great question because obviously nobody really aspires one day to be a mold guy, right? I mean, it's just not like it's not even my kids who think I've got a pretty cool job. I don't think that they aspire to be a mold expert, right? And back then when I got started in this, there was no academic track for it, even if that was the case. This is often a career choice that is sort of maybe a second or third career for many people that are in this space because they were affected or someone that they love was affected, and and I'm no exception. So when I was about 4 years old, I lost a lot of weight in a 3-week period. My parents took me to the pediatrician who said, you got to take him to Children's Hospital. This looks serious. And so the initial diagnosis was cystic fibrosis, which was a devastating diagnosis, especially to my father who lost 4 of his cousins to CF before the age of 14. So it was literally something that my mom and dad had spoken about before they had kids. It was a concern that they had because this is before there was any really reliable genetic testing along these lines. And so they spent the next 6 weeks crying while they waited for a second opinion, which thankfully contradicted the first one. I had asthma compounded by pneumonia, and allergy tests revealed that I was allergic to every single thing that they tested me for. So it was grass, wheat, corn, eggs, dogs, cats, cotton, soybeans. And I grew up on this little non-working farm outside of Princeton, New Jersey. surrounded by all those things in great abundance, So I essentially lived on inhalers, spent a lot of time outside. There was something intuitive. Children are good like this. They tend to know what's good for them, barring the Reese's peanut butter cups and the like. But when it comes to environment, and their intuition is pretty strong. And so I spent most of my time out in the woods, and that was back when kids were allowed to do that. Run around in the woods unsupervised. I lived that like that until I was 12, at which point my folks split up, which was good for everyone involved. Moved out of that musty old farmhouse, and suddenly all my symptoms disappeared. And it wasn't instant, but it was, in retrospect, so abrupt that it should have been tied back to the building, but there just wasn't awareness about that stuff back then. In fact, my grandfather had grown out of his asthma at around the same time, and they just said it was spontaneous adolescent remission, which is a fancy term for it. We have no idea what the hell happened there. We, just moved on in the world. Actually, right after that, my mom died in that same house. She actually committed suicide, which is relevant to the story. And then a year after that, I was diagnosed with Lyme disease, which, as many of the people watching this who have had a mold problem or have had Lyme disease know, that these are kissing cousins and that they exacerbate each other's symptoms. Mold and Lyme together is a real doozy. The combination of my mother's premature departure and Lyme disease forced me to drop out of high school, which is a longer story for another day. It led me to taking a job at the full-time hours at the gas station, where I was already working part-time, where I met a guy who recruited me to come work for him on Wall Street. And that was when I was 16. And within a year, I had become the youngest licensed stockbroker in history. Again, another story for another podcast. That Guinness World Records right there. Yeah. And I did that for about 9 years, and one day woke up and just wasn't having fun anymore, and wanted to do something meaningful with my life. So I went backpacking, and while I was away, I was in Hawaii for a spell, enjoying the freedom of just not having to be in front of that screen, and reading a lot of local newspapers. And one particular story had jumped out at me about a major mold problem that was actually occurring in a building right next to me. It was the Hilton Kalia Tower on Oahu and Waikiki Beach, and had been shut down for a historic mold problem, $50 million in total remediation costs. And the gentleman who was referenced in this article had developed adult onset asthma, something I'd never heard of before, as well as all these allergies that he had never had. So it was like my life in reverse. So a light bulb went on. I called my father immediately from a payphone, which probably isn't there anymore, and asked him if he thought we had a mold problem at home. And he just laughed at me. He goes, "Of course, we had mushrooms in the basement. Why do you ask?" So he was kind of dismissive about it. And I asked him if he thought it was what might have made me sick. And he's like, "Well, couldn't have helped." Typical 70s parent. So to know my father is to love him. So in that moment, people talk about white light moments or like these epiphanies. And
Right.
it was in that moment that I became fascinated, not with mold per se, but with the idea that the buildings that we live and work in can make you sick. That was a really new, big idea for me. That idea has propelled me through to where we are today. But I came back from Hawaii armed with a lot of curiosity, started working in the remediation side of the business to earn while I learned a little. Quickly saw that these guys were doing really bad work in most cases, leaving homes often worse than they found them. So I decided that there was going to be more value for me to help sort of insulate consumers from the contractors through doing inspections and guiding the process and overseeing it, sort of being a gatekeeper on the way in and a warden on the way out, helping people understand this impact. And while I'm learning, I mean, there was no training back then of any significance. I was very self-taught. I had to read building science manuals, and it was very much a labor of love, and still is. We also pioneered the use of mold sniffing dogs, which is a fun conversation to have as well. My dog Oreo and I did thousands of inspections together, which is why we had all that beautiful press that you mentioned in my intro. They were very generous. Everyone loves a rescued dog that's used to fix sick homes, especially when there's little kids involved. So the press ate that up, and that propelled us for a very long time. Our phone rang off the hook for a decade without any advertising. And then in recent years, I became frustrated with the fact that people who needed us the most couldn't afford basic testing. And so that's what led to us creating the Got Mold Test Kit.
I'm really sorry about your loss with your mom. That's a hard one to go through in general, but especially when you're in your formative years. So my heart goes out to you and your family. So the Lyme disease, that's really interesting. Lyme disease is actually what helped me like find you. My husband has Lyme disease and we didn't know it was Lyme, but it affects his ocular nerve. And with situations, heightened emotional, stressful situations, or exposure, you mentioned the Hilton Tower in Waikiki. We both travel a lot for work and we're often in hotels consequently. And with exposure, knowingly or unknowingly, in a hotel to a moldy environment, it can kick off a reaction. And for him, it's quite significant because he can lose his vision. It affects his
Mm,
ocular nerve and he can be down without sight for a day to a week. It just depends. And so it was a mystery. Nobody could tell us what it was. It took nearly 4 years to get to the bottom of it, but we have clarity now and understanding what that is. We had to start to really look at every single thing that we were being exposed to in our life, every single potential toxin, and that included everywhere that we spent time in. I would say it's only been about 24 months that I have been down, I don't know if it's a mold rabbit hole or a mold journey, but trying to understand more about mold and all things mold. And your experience, in the built environment, my background is I spent 20 years, previous to doing C60 World, I'd spent 20 years in commercial real estate. So I was very familiar with the built environment, in and out of all sorts of different types of environments. And so I think it's really interesting. One of the things that you said to me when we first connected, which I did not understand because I was at the beginning of my mold journey, it was around the remediation process and
mm.
specifically what can happen during remediation if somebody is not aware of what they're doing. So as we're recording this, it is January 2025. And, within the last 6 months, many people in the US have been affected by natural disasters, specifically on the East Coast with hurricanes Helene and Milton. I imagine there's a large amount of people right now who are working through not only like what are they going to do if their house is just gone, but the folks who have extreme water damage. This is a common problem for folks who live in coastal areas. It's very serious. And for those of us who don't live in coastal areas but enjoy going to the beach, maybe you're going to an Airbnb or a hotel, you don't know necessarily what you're going to run into, and you don't know what you're going to expose yourself to. Around this time last year, I took a trip down to Uruguay, and I had rented an Airbnb, and I was really excited about it because it looked beautiful in the pictures. But when I got there, I could see mold on the ceiling. And now this was right by the ocean. I could see mold on the window sills. I could see mold on the stairs.
Mm.
So I did not stay there. Immediately, I was in the house and I was like, this is not going to be a good outcome. So we had to leave. I would love it if you could talk a little bit about the built environment. If you could talk a little bit about why it's important to engage somebody who actually understands how to deal with mold if you find out that you have it in your home. And specifically, I'm really curious about what kind of questions you need to be asking, because not all contractors are the same. Let's say you've gone through if you've gone through a natural disaster event, whether that be a flood or a hurricane or a massive rainstorm, and you're dealing with your insurance company, they're likely going to give you, hey, you can use this contractor, this person, and they may or may not have that particular skill set that you're going to talk about. So where I'm trying to go with my line of questioning with you specifically, I want people to understand how to best protect themselves, how to ask great questions, and be an advocate for themselves as they try to repair their home or their environment after some type of moisture exposure.
Sure. So every situation's different. There's no sort of one size fits all approach to these things. Insurance jobs are very different than when you're driving the ship, to your point, because they often do sort of dictate, or at least highly encourage you to use specific contractors, which is sometimes necessary because of the way insurance prices the work. So in other words, if you bring in someone else, it gets so convoluted, and the way the insurance contractors work, they're much less expensive, and that's why the insurance companies use them. But because of that, they also take shortcuts, and they're willing to go in, and they're often very poorly trained, but they're willing to go in and oftentimes tear stuff out without proper controls. So the proper chain of events is that there's a concern, and that concern leads to an inspection, ideally. Now, oftentimes people have a concern and then they're looking for something that's less expensive than an inspection. That's why people buy our test kit. It's like a pregnancy test kit, right? It doesn't replace a doctor's visit. There you go. And
Here.
so the reason we created that was so that people did have a cost-effective first step just to get a gut check. If you've had a water damage event, it's important that you don't delay at all. If you can get to a water damage event within the first 48 hours, you will save yourself a world of hurt. Mold grows very quickly. Within 24 to 40 hours, it will start to germinate. According to the industry standard and according to the insurance industry, at the 72-hour mark, you have to treat everything that got wet and stayed wet as if it's moldy, whether it's visibly moldy or not. Now, at that point, you will have the musty smell. If you smell it, you have it, okay? The musty smell is usually the first clue. And as I mentioned before, it's also a health hazard. And so it's important that you take that message, that signal, that chemical signal very seriously. But when a water damage event occurs and you can get to it within that 72-hour mark, insurance will pay for the water damage restoration. They will not pay for mold. Mold is categorically excluded from all homeowners policies.
If you happen to have flood insurance, likely they will pay for it. If you are somebody who doesn't live in an area where that's coming with your policy and you didn't ask about it because you never foresee that issue, you might be in a situation where you're paying out of pocket. And so this is important, for people to think about, like, would I ever need it? You may.
Yeah. Well, even with flood insurance, if the distinction is water damage and mold. And so
Mhm.
even though mold is the byproduct of water damage,
Yeah.
it's actually regarded very differently because the remediation processes are very different and they cost a
Yeah.
lot more. There's more protective equipment that's necessary. There's engineering controls. There's different licensing requirements in states where licensing is required. Oftentimes there's testing involved, which makes the costs go up when it comes to mold. So water damage is free or cheap to fix. Oftentimes weekend warriors will do that. Now, if you've already had a water damage event, you shouldn't go ripping stuff out. In other words, if you have a pre-existing problem, if you've had this happen before and water comes back, don't start ripping stuff out because you'll contaminate everything. But if this is the first time this has happened, it's not a bad thing to consider just tearing out wet wallboard while it's wet if you can't get contractors, especially in a situation where there's a widespread flood and the building has been deemed safe and all that stuff. Not a bad idea sometimes to remove that stuff because if the 72-hour mark, again, it becomes a mold issue, and then insurance either caps the claim or sometimes just denies it fully. And then you're cash pay. Now you got to get the guys in moon suits. The whole thing changes. It's disruptive. You often have to move out of the house. A perfect mold remediation project done that way takes a month between the testing and the inspections and the testing at the end. It's important that you run towards it. Now, if you don't have the luxury of being able to identify a moisture problem within the first 72 hours, which is the vast majority of cases, most people don't know that they've got a mold problem. The window's been leaking, or they've got something going on in a wall, or there's just high humidity because ventilation, whatever the case may be. If you've got mold in your house and it's not tied to a water event that you can get to quickly, then there's a whole different conversation. Really, it's important to consider getting an inspection done because the inspector is not paid by the pound. Do you know what I mean by that? So inspectors are paid for their time and advice. They're paid for their experience, really. And their job is really to identify the where it is and where it isn't so that it can be surgically removed. If you bring in a contractor to do that inspection, they're paid by the pound, right? The bigger the project, the bigger the paycheck for them. And so the last thing you want to do is let them be the ones who dictate how much gets removed. And then certainly you want to have accountability because contractors will do much better work if they know they're being tested, right? No one ever studies for a test they're not going to take. And so contractors who aren't going to be, where there's no accountability, will run roughshod. It's just the way it is. And so it's human nature, especially in the mold industry where it's just filled with opportunists. So basically the ideal situation is you get an inspector, they come in, they identify, delineate, see where it starts, where it ends. They figure out where the moisture problem is. And that's numero uno, by the way. In all cases, a mold problem is a moisture problem. This is the most important thing I'm going to say today. A mold problem is a moisture problem. Mold isn't actually the problem. The moisture is the problem. The mold is the symptom. In fact, the mold is giving you a signal something's wrong, right? The mold tells you that something's wrong, and it usually shows up as an odor or a symptom. And that's the clue that your building is sick. When buildings get sick, people get sick. When buildings heal, people heal. There's a symbiotic relationship there. When the inspector does their job, and this is very important, they will provide you with a written report. You ask about what questions should be asked, right? What will I get for my inspection? Well, you're not just going to get a lab report. If you just get a lab report, you've been ripped off. You need to get a
Okay.
full written report with a scope of work, a detailed step-by-step process for what needs to be repaired. And that's first. The first thing in remediation is to fix the water. The root word of remediation is remedy. What are we remedying? We're remedying a moisture problem. And then they will figure out what areas need to be removed: sheetrock, insulation, carpet padding, porous materials that have support mold growth need to be removed. Notice I didn't say anything about killing, right? There's no need to attack the mold. We're going to remove it. So they're going to identify what things need to be removed, and then what areas need to be cleaned. Now, you may be removing moldy wallboard from one room, but if you do proper testing, you may find that the mold has already contaminated the whole house. So the whole house may need to be cleaned, not fogged, not sprayed, not sanitized, right? These are all things that relate to bacterial issues where you have sewage and things like that. Mold doesn't need that. Mold needs to be removed, and then the mess that it made needs to be cleaned. And so an inspector will walk you through that process. That process, by the way, it's codified in a book called the IICRC S as in standard 520. This is the Bible of the mold industry. Anyone who you hire to do an inspection or remediation, you should ask them what standards they follow. If they tell you the New
Can
York City,
anybody buy this book?
it is as dense as marble. You don't want to buy it or read it. It's industry speak. Yes, you can buy it. It's
Okay.
behind a pay. It's like $100. And I know people who have bought it. I know lay people who have bought it and remediated it themselves, and
Okay, so
wisely.
somebody does, can we get it on Amazon?
I think you have to go to iicrc.org to get it.
Okay. We might
But
try to pop that down here just for those of us that want to go deep into it.
yep,
There's like five
absolutely.
people maybe, but maybe we'll put it right here. I'm
Yeah, I
sorry
think
to.
I think IICRC S520 and IICRC.org are worth pointing to because
Okay.
they are sort of the last vestige of common sense in the industry. Honestly,
Okay. All
they're the
right.
touchstone. They're the things that we always point back to. It's the only consensus accepted standard that exists in our space. Now, there's a water damage standard, there's a mold remediation standard, and then there's an inspection standard coming out, which my friend John LaPatera is the chair of. And so eventually we'll have the whole thing codified so that you'll be able to just say, look, just look at the book. It's very important that you ask what standards they follow. With an inspector, you want to also find out what kind of testing they do. If they're doing tests like ERMI, which is a dust test that's always high, I would be highly suspicious. If they're using swabs, that's also suspicious because they're always high. You really want someone who's got an objective view on this that doesn't also have a relationship with the contractors. You want to ask them, do you do remediation also? If they say yes, that's a no-go. Do you have any financial relationship with your contractor? Yeah, most people won't admit that, but that's a very important question because it's got to be a point blank answer. No, God forbid it goes to discovery. You can find that out later. You know what I mean? So
Yeah.
ultimately, the key is that they need to be independent. They need to provide a written report that details exactly what work needs to be done, including clearance criteria, which means how do you know that a project is done? And so that needs to be detailed out exactly whether it's air quality, surfaces, combination thereof, obviously visual. You have to make sure that the moisture problem has been corrected. So the hiring the inspector part, people want to skip over that because they just want to immediately go right to remediation. But that would be like immediately scheduling heart surgery because you've got high cholesterol, right? Like you need a workup. You need to figure out what the extent of this problem is, what kind of surgeries you need. Fools rush in. When it comes to selecting a remediation contractor, you're going to want to make sure that they follow the IICRC S520. But that's the most important thing. You're going to want to make sure that they are willing to submit themselves to third-party testing. This is key. If they're not willing to submit themselves to third-party testing, that means that they're not willing to be accountable. And they need to be willing to agree to the clearance criteria that's provided in the report that was generated by the inspector. So this may sound like a lot, but you know what happens when people don't follow this process? They get taken to the cleaners, and or they end up with a situation where the walls get ripped open, a small contained problem in one room suddenly contaminates the whole house, and it goes from a $5,000 or $10,000 project to a $35,000 project. Everybody's sick, you're displaced. These are the nightmare stories you hear about, and that's because people hurry up and they rush through this process. This is a big deal, and it needs to be done thoughtfully.
For people that end up having mold exposure, knowingly or unknowingly, what are some of the negative health outcomes or events that you've seen in your industry with people coming to you? Like, what do you know about what's happening to people's health?
The list is so long, and this is one of the tricky parts about diagnosing mold-related illness. It's a lot like Lyme in the sense that it shows up in so many different ways, right? The way mold affects people is through allergic reactions, through toxic reactions, inflammatory responses, and through infection. Okay, so
Mhm.
allergies are obvious, right? So you're going to have, upper respiratory stuff, sinusitis, asthma, which is, by the way, also inflammatory. So it's a little bit of both, as well as things like hives, itchy eyes. I will, when I walk into a moldy building these days, by the way, an absent my chronic exposure, as a child, I am no longer allergic to anything. I don't test positive for anything, and I haven't had to use an inhaler since I moved out of that house. So, that's the optimistic story for people. They need
Yeah.
to know that this is not necessarily a cross that you need to bear for the rest of your life. The allergies are sort of the typical response that most people attribute to mold exposure. Inflammatory responses are probably the most insidious of them. The inflammatory and the toxic responses oftentimes are confused with each other and oftentimes coexist. In fact, the allergic, inflammatory, and toxic responses often coexist.
Yeah.
And so that's what makes it really, really challenging. And so the inflammatory responses often show up as your autoimmune disease flare up, right? It shows up as puffiness and lethargy, cognitive impairment is a big deal, right? So headaches, nausea, dizziness, fatigue, difficulty concentrating, that can both be a toxic or an inflammatory response. And so you start getting into, any symptom that you can name, you can pretty much tag mold on it as either a cause or aggravator. That's not to say that it's the underlying cause of all of these things. It is to
Hmm.
say that you should consider it as a potential underlying cause, or at the very least, sort of the straw that breaks the camel's back. And that's often what it is, right? So the most common thing we see is that someone's doing okay, or they think they're doing okay because their
Hmm.
idea of their baseline health is actually lower than it should be. And then they end up with an exposure, and suddenly, the wheels come off the bus and they
Right.
blame the mold. But they've already had other stuff going on, and it just brings out the latent symptom profile that has been simmering beneath the surface. Again,
Yeah.
Lyme will do that too, but mold is really tricky along these lines. And then for people that have really, compromised immune systems, and by the way, mold can compromise your immune system to make you susceptible to infections, but also people that already have like cancer, HIV, a recent organ transplant, things like that. Those people are highly susceptible to fungal infections in their respiratory tract, and in
Mhm.
some cases on their skin. But generally speaking, the most common symptoms are the ones that I listed earlier, and it's tricky stuff. The best test is often to get out of the building for a little while. If you notice that when you leave the building, for any length of time, sometimes it's a matter of hours, sometimes it's a matter of days, and you feel better, that's a big red flag. That's almost a dead giveaway that you've got something going on in the home, something brewing.
You're home and you're just chronically not feeling good, but then you go and visit a relative or you go on a trip and you feel amazing. But then when you go back home, you're sick again.
Yep.
You should pay attention. Is mold a problem for pets?
Well, it's actually something we talk about quite a bit. So, babies, little kids, pets, they breathe a lot more than we do. Babies
Really?
breathe up to 100,000 times a day. Yeah, it's a very quick respiration cycle. And
Okay.
so, babies that are exposed to air pollution have 5 times the exposure than the adults in the same room. So, a baby and an adult in the same room breathing the same air actually has 5 times the exposure per pound of body weight. They're much more susceptible to these things. Plus, they've got a developing immune system where every breath they take, every breath you take, by the way, is a learning experience. Your immune system is learning from the spores and the pollen and the particles that come into your lungs, little hormetic stressors. When a baby is getting this, it's learning that this is normal, and sometimes it's too much and it will start to develop severe allergies and inflammatory conditions and things like that. And so, babies exposed to the musty smell have twice the risk of developing asthma later in life. So it's a big deal. It is the second leading predictor of asthma in childhood behind maternal smoking, mold exposure in early age. So it's a big deal. Dogs and babies also have this unusual sort of similarity in the sense that they are on the ground and they are closer to where these particles, spores, settle out. They're stirring these things up and they're in close proximity to what we call a reservoir, which is where these things tend to settle out and concentrate. In addition to breathing them in and having this incredible multiplier on exposure, they also have something called incidental ingestion, where it gets on their hands and then they lick it. Pets and babies can ingest upwards of 100 milligrams a day of household dust, which contains all sorts of stuff in addition to mold, including all the little paint particles, all these really nasty sort of chemical bits that you don't want your baby or your puppy eating. And so that's an important point, though. You should keep your house clean of those things. HEPA filters, HEPA vacuums. That's what that stuff is really all about. HEPA filters and HEPA vacuums are not so much to keep your house free of mold spores. More broadly, that you should use those to reduce the chemical load in your home, in the sense of these little flecks of building shed, particles from carpet, all of these things all condense into household dust, flame retardants, you name it. So removing those things is beyond mold. It's really for general health.
For our listeners, if you're watching on YouTube, I'm going to pop up a video regarding C60 and chemical exposure right here. So if you want to dive into more chemical exposure, I'm going to share a little link right here. Check that out. So Jason, this is just fascinating. So I want to shift gears just a little bit because I know we're running short on time. I could talk to you all day. So we'll probably have to do a few of these episodes. There's so much to learn with your expertise. I'm blown away. I want to go back to the pregnancy test. Okay. If we have a suspicion, or we're just curious, maybe we don't even have a suspicion. We're just like, hey, I want to know, does my home have mold in it? Can you tell us a little bit about your kit and what you've created here? Because this is a simple, fast, effective way, relatively affordable, that people could use to get to the bottom of their curiosity and their question. And then I'm assuming through your company that you probably offer some resources and information like that. So I want to get into that, because speaking about my own life, it has been a very important thing to understand and to explore as it relates to attempting to help my husband move into remission with his Lyme disease. And you're someone who also struggles with Lyme. So why don't you just talk a little bit about that? And then I'd also, if you don't mind, help us understand why Lyme and mold kind of go hand in hand.
Well, first of all, people often ask me, when should I use your test kit? And I always say, if you see something, smell something, or feel something, do something, right? So if you see a moisture condition, condensation, staining, discoloration, trim pulling away from walls, any sign of dampness, that's a red flag. That's worthy of taking a next step. If you smell that musty smell, dead giveaway. If you feel something, and especially if it gets better when you leave the building, that's a dead giveaway. But more recently, this notion comes to mind, which is that 35% of the United States population suffers from some sort of chronic systemic inflammation. And that number is probably very low. And nobody knows exactly what's going on there. We've got a lot of reasons why we would be inflamed. But 47% of homes have a mold or moisture problem of significance, according to Lawrence Berkeley Labs. 47%. I mean, that's a huge number, right? So the question is, how much of those 35% that have chronic systemic inflammation are actually suffering from some sort of mold issue that they're not aware of? And so
a lot of our listeners right now, right?
Probably, right? So they may not see something or smell something, but they may feel something, and they may not know that they're feeling this, right? They may be blaming it on whatever and taking a bunch of aspirin or, bromelain if they're a little on the naturopathic side of things. But my point is that if you have anything that's going on in your life when you feel dysregulated, and emotional dysregulation is a common symptom too. Mold rage is real. This is a call to arms in a way, because, everyone's going to get a colonoscopy at some point, whether you like it or not. And so you might consider testing your house as one of those unpleasant realities, as a check the box kind of a thing. Protect your family, protect your health. No, it's better to have peace of mind and know for sure that you're not breathing in high mold spore counts. But in some cases, you might be surprised. And if that's the case, the quicker you get to it, the better off you will be, because mold does one thing better than anything else. It grows. And the longer it grows, the bigger it gets. The bigger it gets, the more expensive it is to remove. So the quicker you get to it, the better off you are. So now, how does the test kit work? If you hired a professional to come out and test your house, they'd come out and they'd do an inspection, they'd look around, and then at the end, depending upon what they found or didn't find, they would recommend air sampling in most cases. The air sampling uses a cassette known as a spore trap. These round engineered cassettes capture microscopic particles. Air is drawn through these. Now, a professional has a expensive $1,000 calibrated pump that pulls the air through. What we did was we figured out how to make one for a whole lot less. And so these cassettes fit directly onto the pump. They run for 5 minutes. When you're done, you put the seals back on, and it goes back in a prepaid return mailer, which goes to our lab partner, which is Eurofins, the #1 lab in the world. And they do the analysis, and you'll get your results within 3 business days. And as you can attest, because you've seen our reports, you get a beautiful color-coded, very easy to understand red, green, yellow, orange, red interpretation, right? It's a very simple report on the cover page. The second page has all the lab data, again, color coded, so you can understand exactly what's going on and where. And then the third page has links to different resources: how to hire a mold inspector, where to find the qualified inspectors and remediators in your area, as well as some other self-assessment tools, and a link to our ebook, which we get rave reviews about. This is about 46 pages of inspection checklists and FAQs that guides people through their early mold awareness to help them avoid many of the potholes and pitfalls. In fact, many of the things we talked about with regards to how to hire an inspector and a remediator are included in that ebook. So that's a link on every single one of our reports. We have 1, 2, and 3 room kits. And once you buy a kit, you get the pump, and you get to keep the pump, and then you can buy refills, which are $50 less. So 1 room kits are $199, all lab fees and shipping included, nothing else the purchaser pay for. 2 room is $249, and a 3 room is $299. And as I mentioned, the refills are $50 less each.
Rapid fire question, because we're about to wrap this up. Mold and Lyme, why do they go hand in hand?
Number one, mold and Lyme trigger cytokine storms. If you have that happening from 2 different assaults, it's like having 2 tractor trailers going down a one lane road, right? It's very, very painful for the person who's experiencing this. And also, mold and Lyme both can trigger cell danger response. And so what you end up with is essentially, this is why fatigue is one of the most common symptoms of mold and Lyme. So you end up losing all of your mitochondria, stop producing energy, and they go into cellular defense mode. And so when that happens, nothing works well. Your cells stop communicating with each other. The ion channels close down, and it becomes very difficult for all of your systems to work properly. And so those are the 2 big reasons. There's all sorts of other things with the hypothalamus pituitary axis issue. There's lots of different sort of more complex reasons why these things are sort of a double whammy. But for the sake of our listeners and for the sake of brevity, really what it comes down to is that it's a double whammy, and like I said, you're pushing too much stuff down one tube, if you will.
Yeah. So if you've got mold exposure, or you're dealing with one of these other kind of chronic diseases that are affected or can be triggered by mold, you're likely also experiencing some fatigue, some sluggish energy. And that's kind of where C60 and gotmold.com kind of come together hand in hand to work together in a synergistic manner. I know you've had a chance to try some for a while. I don't know what your favorite is, but maybe you want to give us 10 seconds on kind of your experience so far, what you've noticed as someone who's struggled with mold, who currently is dealing with Lyme and has had, chronic allergies throughout your life.
Yeah, and I also happen to have a 3-year-old and a 5-year-old, so energy is,
You're busy and you're an entrepreneur.
and an entrepreneur. So,
Mhm.
um,
Yeah.
so energy is something and I'm also struggling right now, as I mentioned before we hit record, with caffeine withdrawal. I'm 2 weeks into, a caffeine fast, and so
I'm so
uh,
proud of you.
no, thank you. I'll take all the encouragement and support I can get. C60 for me is fast. First, I take the avocado version of it, and I also love my gummies, my sugar-free gummies. I'm a sugar-free guy. Like many of my favorite supplements, I notice it more when I don't take it. So as a result, what I find is that I tend to find the most benefit in the afternoon. because I do get a little bit of a boost. I also don't always have time to eat, and so the gummies will be a meager substitute for a for a meal or a snack. But they seem to really hold me over, which is kind of remarkable. In fact, I mentioned this too before we hit record. I was grabbing those by the handful at A4M at the conference in December because it's just too busy to eat. So I find that I've got better mental clarity. I find that my energy is great and stable. And I will take your advice to start taking this with some of my other supplements to accelerate absorption and assimilation. So yeah, overall, I'm a big fan. I'm pretty selective about my supplements. I'm not the kind of guy that has 50 supplements. I'm not Dave Asprey, but I do have a regimen, and I'm reluctant to add new things to it. And this is one that I'm proud to have, and also that I will be I think an avid user for a very long time to come.
Thank you. I appreciate that. We have a special treat for you. This is a time sensitive offer, though, and we're going to put all the information in the show notes. But Jason is having a mold summit. And so if you're interested in learning more about mold in 2025, the summit is going to be between February 21st and February 23rd. And we are going to pop that information in the show notes below for you guys. And Jason, anything else you'd like to say? Because I know you got to jump. I really appreciate your time and all of your wisdom. And I definitely want to reconnect soon to further explore this topic of mold.
Absolutely. I would say that if anybody wants to dig in a little bit more, you can go to gotmold.com/C60 health. And there you'll find that ebook that I mentioned, as well as a 10% discount coupon for anyone who wants to purchase it. In fact, I believe we'll have this be a 20% coupon for a week after the show airs, and then we'll drop it back down to the standard 10%. But that coupon code is C60 for anyone who's interested. And then, of course, if anybody ever has any questions about mold, you go to gotmold.com. We have a contact field at the bottom. I don't answer all the questions, but I do see them all, and we're pretty vigilant about answering those quickly. We're here to help.
Man, amazing. Jason, thank you so much for the work that you're doing in the world to help us all stay healthy and live a mold-free life. I really appreciate you and your contribution to humanity and to all of our beloved pets on the planet. Thank you so much, and I'll look forward to speaking with you again soon.
Thanks for having me.
Power in your purpose.